Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Today, our guest is author Tom McMillan, and he'll be discussing his new book, The Year That Made America From Rebellion to Independence, 1775 to 1776. Tom, thank you for joining us.
Brady, great to be here.
So, Tom, you're a first time guest. You've written several remarkable books covering a huge span of American history: the War of 1812, most notably, I think, the Civil War. You've done incredible work there. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm from Pittsburgh, as you are, which is where our connection started. Recently retired from a 43-year career in sports media and communications, which is not the normal background for writing history. I get that. People look at me, how'd that happen? But I took one of those tests in high school where they try to figure out what your best career would be, and my top two careers were newspaper writer and history teacher. So I was able
So
to
you
turn
wanted
one
big
into my
money,
profession
money,
and the
right?
other,
Yeah, you wanted a big
yeah,
money making operation.
yeah, and the other into my hobby. So history has always been there. And my first book was on Flight 93, actually, the September 11th flight in 2014. And once you realize you can do it, I got addicted to it. And I'm such a history nerd that I've now done. This was my fifth book, so it's a good hobby. Keeps you out of trouble.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about your title of this book, Tom, if we could. Um, you say this is 75 to 76, the year that made America. People like David McCullough have just said 76. You included this 2 year span, essentially. What most influenced you to say that?
Well, I think it was talking with my editor because I had a couple ideas for titles, and for people who haven't written books, uh, the author can only suggest a title. The publishing company decides the title. We kicked it around. My actually first idea for a title was July 2nd, 1776, because I kind of wanted to point out that that actually should be the Independence Day. That's when the vote happened, and so there are a lot of dates beyond July 4th. We get so wrapped up in July 4th when not a heck of a lot happened on that day. But they thought, looking at it, the focus is mostly on the Declaration of Independence. It was about an 8 month run, and he said, "No, that I agree with your point. That's the point. It wasn't one day. It wasn't 1 month. This was a year long thing. And you can take it back to 1775. Certainly, at the end of 75, to give a preamble, you just can't start at 1776. So that was kind of the reason to do it. The idea being, about eight of my chapter titles are dates, and the point being." There were many dates that were absolutely crucial. If the events of those dates had not happened, any of them, we'd be telling a different story today. So we focus so much on the 4th of July, and there's so much else that happens. And that was kind of the reason to emphasize the year as opposed to 1 day or 1 month.
Yeah, Tom, I'm glad you said that. This is a show we like to sometimes get into the weeds of the writing process, the editorial process. You have a title when you start a book. You almost never get that title when you publish it because editors know how to sell books, and we historians
Exactly.
don't.
That's part of it too.
That's a
I
big
was
part.
told dates don't really sell unless you're David McCullough. Dates don't sell books, so you
That's
need
fair.
something more than a date. So
Another notable Pittsburgher, though, David
yes,
McCullough. Um, so, so Tom, you've written about big swaths of really important events in American history. We were talking a little bit off air. This was the first time you really dug into 18th century sources. What was there a moment when you were writing when you realized, I'm really on to something here?
yeah, there were. It all started for me, Brady. The real interest we all have interest in 4th of July, 1776. It goes back to the John Adams miniseries on HBO. I was always fascinated by that second episode that's on the Declaration because there's not a good documentary on how the Declaration came about. Ken Burns touched on it in about 15 seconds, and it was always in my head. And I started one day just to start reading about it. There's that great resource that the archives has online called Founders Online. There's all tens of thousands of letters from all these guys. And I started to realize, and I thought, I'm a pretty good student of history. I never knew any of this stuff. I didn't know that this happened. We tend to, I know this group is really focused on the revolution in the 18th century, but for most people, even history buffs, we go from Lexington and Concord to the 4th of July to Washington crossing the Delaware, and not a lot happened in between, and we don't focus on that. And there was so much texture to what happened, to the point that I could say, and I mentioned in the book, it almost didn't happen when it did. Independence always was going to happen. It didn't have to happen in July, and it almost didn't. I mean, not to get too far into the weeds right now, but July 1st, then July 1st, there's still 4 colonies that aren't voting for independence. This came right down to the wire, and I really started in January down to through this voting in July.
Yeah, one of the things I love about this book, Tom, is that you you kind of introduce us to a lot of different characters. Um, and when you study these people, you read their letters, you do feel like you're talking to them in
Yeah.
a way. Were there any people that really stood out to you, people you feel like you know so much better now because of your research?
Well, all of them really, because I didn't. The one I knew most about was Adams, because I'm such a David McCullough fan. I'd read so much about John Adams and watched so much, but I learned about him. I had, it was really luck of the draw that Thomas Jefferson got this assignment. Um, it was there were the odds were not would have been against him writing the Declaration of Independence. But then you also learn about guys whose names I heard. None of them are totally anonymous, but John Dickinson and Richard Henry Lee. I mean, Richard Henry Lee should absolutely be more famous in American history. He's the guy who proposed independence to the Continental Congress. We barely mentioned his name. He's kind of a goofy character in the musical 1776, but that's really the only time. But what got me when I was looking at that is, okay, he proposed independence. Why wasn't he on the committee to write the Declaration? Because he's the Virginia firebrand. He leads the delegation. He's the guy who proposed independence. And they'd been in Philadelphia for a long time. Virginia was writing their colonial constitution. And back then, that was more important than what was happening nationally. They wanted the great Richard Henry Lee back home. And he'd also found out that his wife had recently fallen ill. He hadn't been home for a while. He wanted to go check on her. So he proposes independence, and then he up and leaves a few days later. I believe that if Richard Henry Lee had not left, he would have been Virginia's representative on that committee, not Thomas Jefferson. And either Lee or John Adams would have written a Declaration of Independence. It would have read differently, and the arc of Jefferson's career would have changed completely. He might have never become president. So many times, you know better than most, these little quirks of fate in history, but it's something I wouldn't have known about. It frustrates me that we don't know more about him, but it also it really was opened my eyes to the fact of how close this came and how how our whole history would be different, since it's based on the Declaration, if Lee or John Adams would have written it.
Right. So you touched on something really important, Tom, and I think not enough people, both regular American civilians and historians, understand this. The debates leading up to the Declaration. I mean, if they did they understand, in your opinion, that they were on the cusp of a revolution, or was there a gray area for a lot of these men?
In the Congress?
Yes.
I by this point, I think they grasped it. I really did. I think they sensed, certainly Adams, when you read his writing, he knows that he's talking about this. And I think with the quote opposition led by John Dickinson, it was a moderate. I mean, he knew independence was going to happen. He just didn't think it should happen then. So I think they realized, Dickinson basically was going to put his career on the line to try to stop this. They're yelling at each other. They're calling each other names. They're writing about each other in letters. I think the kind of vitriol that happened underscores that they knew this was really important. I think they had a sense that they had a world-changing opportunity here, but you just didn't know what was going to happen. You wish I could go back and watch some of those sessions in May, as this was developing. We have some of their letters, which gives you some insight, but you wonder what was going through their heads at that point. You wonder at the moment when Richard Henry Lee proposes it, these United Colonies to be free and independent states. I mean, it had to take all of their breath away. The pro-independence guys and the anti-independence people. I think they did have a pretty good sense.
So let's get back to, you mentioned Lee. When you study the Continental Congress, it is just a wide assortment of characters. Some very dynamic, some less so. Tell us about maybe some of the lesser known characters that really grasped your attention, and maybe if we could talk about your process of finding their letters and information and capturing their voice a little bit for someone who might want to write a history book?
Yeah. Well, in the middle known category, I always have to talk about John Dickinson because we know his name, but not a lot of people delve into him. And I really think it's a lesson because here's a guy who didn't believe they were going in the right direction, had the guts to stand up, even though he could tell at the very end it was going against him, didn't vote for independence, didn't sign the Declaration of Independence, yet joined the militia and served in the Revolutionary War. And isn't that a lesson some of us could learn today? Some of our politicians could learn today. So he fascinates me. I think, if you watch the Adams miniseries, he comes off as kind of the opposition, not quite a villain, but you don't really like John Dickinson. But I came to really like him and admire him, admire someone, even if you disagree with them, for having the courage of their convictions. He had the ultimate courage of conviction. He was standing up against these other patriots, trying to say this is not the time to do it. And as he said, he knew it was going to ruin his reputation, and in many ways it did. But then he picked up arms and was willing to participate in the Revolutionary War. The other one, again, going back to that miniseries, was Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, who again in that one comes off as and it's talking about that. We're not talking 1776. This is based on McCullough's book, so it's based on a pretty good basis of fact. But Rutledge again comes off as a villain and an opposing voice. Yet he was the one in mid-June of 1776 when they weren't sure where the vote was going, and Jefferson said if they had voted then, independence might have passed by a 7-6 margin. He was the one who said, let's hold this up for 3 weeks, send back to our colonial assemblies and see if we can get some clarity of instruction. So some of these guys, because of what we've seen in the modern media, we have maybe more negative impressions of them. I did, certainly, before I got into it. And then you start reading and say, okay, I appreciate what this guy was doing, what these guys were doing. And as far as learning them, I mentioned briefly before, the website Founders Online is just fantastic. I had never heard of it before. I stumbled onto it. You can, if listeners, viewers have not seen it, you can lose yourself for hours or days in there if you want to, especially when it's snowing and cold. You could not possibly get to the bottom of all those letters. But even, as you know, Brady, doing this, even letters that aren't directly affecting your book, you get caught up in them because they tell you something about the person, the way they viewed this issue, the way they addressed this person. And so they're really insightful. And it's as insightful as we can get to these guys because we can't hear their voices. There are no recordings, obviously. And some of them did write kind of memoirs, but the letters are really the windows into their souls. And I spent so much time at Founders Online and still do, because I enjoy it so much. And with the 250th coming, I think we can all learn, no matter even the most learned person about this era can continue to learn by reading those letters on Founders Online.
Yeah, Tom, I'm really excited to have you on the show because to me, when I think of your books, I really think of the Civil War era. You've really brought that whole period to life for us. Now, you could argue that is a failed rebellion, obviously. Does that give you any insight into this revolution, right, in the 1776? Maybe that a revolutionary-only scholar wouldn't have. Did your Civil War research color or shape your opinion of this rebellion in any way?
Only in the sense, Brady, that you realize that the Revolutionary War was a civil war. We don't call it that, but it was. It was what we call the Civil War was actually the second Civil War that we had. It was the 1860 Civil War. This was the 1776, 77, 78 Civil War. That's what it was. I mean, you look into it, and I think a lot of, again, going back to what a lot of people, not this audience, but what a lot of people think, they think it was just this patriotic swirl. Everybody got together with patriotism on July 4th and signed the Declaration of Independence. It was a battle. Adams himself said the country was probably split into thirds. 1/3 patriots, 1/3 loyalists, and 1/3 in the middle. And I think maybe the real importance at that time of the Declaration of Independence was, one, it gave the soldiers who were fighting a reason to fight. before this, they were fighting to restore their rights within the British Empire. It's tough to get really passionate about that. This gave them all of a sudden a reason. It gave them a focus, and I think it started to tilt the 1/3 in the middle. They now had something to make a decision on, and probably tilted more of them. So I think sometimes we don't think of that. Some of the governmental things that happen, the legislative things that happen that affect people at the time. It takes a while to spread back then, obviously, the way news got around. But it struck me, it was a civil war, and it was our first civil war. And I think the Declaration is what started to turn the tide toward the Patriots.
Absolutely. So Tom, when you finish this book, do you feel like there's one big takeaway that you want readers to have? Because sometimes you frame an argument when you start writing and then you end up somewhere you didn't expect. I think that's one of the best things about writing. What was that for you? I mean, what's the if a regular person goes to work, comes home, picks up a book, non-historian or historian reads the book, I mean, what would you want them to take away from it?
That it almost didn't happen. We think when it did, it was going to happen at some point. But I think we just take it for granted that for most people who read about history casually, that it just happened, and it's like fingernails on a chalkboard when I see all the tweets and posts every 4th of July. This is the day they signed the Declaration of Independence. No, it isn't, for one thing. There are a lot of facts that are part of the myth that are not true. But I think it was just the 8-month effort, battle, quagmire to get to this resolution that came down to the very last night before the votes. And I think most people don't know that. It really opened my eyes. And maybe the other thing, Brady, is that we talk about chaos in modern America. We were founded on political chaos. I think what's happening today is abhorrent, but it started that way. If you read what these guys were saying about each other in letters and how they mocked each other and the partisan press, and yet somehow in the middle of that, they were able to come together and overcome that and come up with this, incredible document that set out American ideals. And you really, I'm amazed at that. I think, too much we talk about these guys as being mythical or magical. They weren't. They were regular guys. They were very smart, but they were regular guys. But they came together in that moment. We were able to pull it together. When I get a sense of patriotism, it's these guys pulling together even after they're knocking heads and coming to this resolution and knowing at the whole way that they were committing treason if England had won this war. They were all going to hang for treason, and they knew that. There's that great moment in the Adams miniseries right after they vote for independence, about 30 seconds of silence as they're panning the faces of those guys. And it's like, oh my God, what have we done? Because I think they all realized it. And certainly Adams and Jefferson and Franklin did.
So Tom, what did you find about Jefferson? Because I think one of the big messages you get with a very cursory glance is that the Declaration is kind of Jefferson's intellectual triumph. He certainly was instrumental, but there were other voices involved.
Oh, yeah. It is amazing. I didn't know it. I knew a little bit, but I didn't know anywhere near the depth of this. That certainly he's the primary author, but there are 86 editorial changes made to that draft. 47 changes are made by the committee that he's on with Adams and Franklin and Roger Sherman and Robert R. Livingston, and 39 more changes made by Congress as a whole. And Congress does some pretty big surgery. They cut out 25% of what he wrote. They completely eliminated his passage blaming black slavery on the King of England. I mean, Congress thought that was a ridiculous thing for Jefferson to say. And they significantly rewrote the final paragraph, which to them was the most important paragraph. That's where they declare independence. I think most Americans don't know that. That is where they declare independence. We focus so much today on the soaring language of the second paragraph, self-evident truths, all men are created equal. They blew right by that back then. And they knew the writing style in the 18th century was to build to a crescendo and make your point at the end. And there were some phrases that were used throughout the debates on independence that they really liked, and they wanted them included in the document. and they put them in there as final edits. They put them in there, and it's one of the reasons why there are actually some phrases of the Declaration of Independence on the wall of the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., that were not written by Thomas Jefferson. And that shocks people. Say, how did that happen? It was, they were putting the memorial together in the 1940s. They have to come up with words. Declaration has 1,300 words. They all can't go on the wall. They make their choice. But the president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, wanted to have his say. Big historian, big fan of Jefferson. And he knew that last paragraph was really important to those 1776 guys. And he wanted some of those phrases in there. And so he put some of them in. And that's why they're on the wall. And he didn't know that some of the stuff he put in was what Jefferson didn't write, because he bought the myth we all used to buy that Jefferson wrote the whole thing. I mean, does it matter? No, I mean, everything gets edited. Our books are edited. But I think we do have this belief that Jefferson wrote the whole thing, that it was totally Jeffersonian, and it wasn't. And the really frustrating thing to me is that most of the changes, only 7 of those 86 changes are identified as to who did them. He gives credit to Franklin for 5, Adams for 2, and the others we don't know. We don't know who in Congress made some of those changes. I wish they had written those things down. So much was going on. Maybe they didn't think it was that important. Maybe it was too painstaking. But we just don't know who made some of those changes, including self-evident, which is all historians credit to Benjamin Franklin. I was stunned to find out there is not one primary source, not one, that gives Franklin credit for that change.
Yeah, welcome to the rabbit hole, Tom. You're in the hole now. I'd like to posit this to you, Tom. You mentioned that in the 18th century, works build to a crescendo at the end. Whenever I read the Declaration of Independence and I teach it, I say to my students, the beginning, it almost seems like it embodies the main spirit of the document. We hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. It's almost like a promise of not what America was, because we obviously know slavery exists, major issues with Native American policy, but it's almost a promise for the future of what we could be someday. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Was there any sense of that in the 18th century, or is that me reading history backwards?
I think there's a danger to read history backwards. We all do it. It's seductive to do that. We try to put ourselves in their mindset, and they just don't explain that much. Jefferson never really explained what he meant by those words. He certainly never explained all the charges he made against the king, which is the bulk of the Declaration of Independence, by the way. As you know, the National Park Service in Philadelphia on July 8th, which is the day it was first read in public in Philadelphia on July 8th, 1776, behind Independence Hall. They hold a reenactment. And my wife and I went there last year. There were about 300 people there. They had loyalists and patriots walking through the audience yelling things. But I noticed looking around that people know the second paragraph. And then the audience kind of got bored, because I think a lot of people don't realize that most of the Declaration of Independence is a list of grievances against King George III. So I think when you read it, sometimes we don't understand even some of those things, what Jefferson was talking about. He had reasons for making his case. He never really explained it word by word. None of those guys did. I think so much was going on at the same time that they didn't have enough time to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, the document always reveals to me that there's so much that the average person may have known that we've lost sight of. Jefferson obviously carefully selects his laundry list of complaints. And some of those don't resonate with us at all looking backwards, but it certainly would have meant something at the time. So, Tom, you are a very busy writer. You're really dove headfirst. What are you working on now? Can you tell us?
Yeah, I've just finished a book. Actually, it's coming out in July. It's another 9/11 book tied to the 25th anniversary. So it's the 250th anniversary with this book. I'm on my anniversary kick. I had done a book on Flight 93 years ago. Really enjoyed it. It was a very emotional experience, obviously, and met some family members. And it just struck me, Brady, that we're now 25 years in, and those families still haven't gotten any justice. The 5 suspects at Guantanamo still haven't gone to trial. There's a lawsuit against Saudi Arabia that still is stuck in the discovery phase, 25 years later. So knowing some of the family members, I reached out and I said, nobody's covering this. Is this a story? And they said yes. So it's the title is Justice for the Forgotten Families of 9/11.
I look forward to it. Well, Tom, it's great to talk to you again, and thank you for your time.
Brady, my pleasure. Thank you.